Hello, my name is Ghanwa Hakim, and you are watching The Arabic Hour. Today, we bring you peace activist from Jerusalem, Sahar Vardi.
And one of the important things about that holiday, the main commandment is to remember. But one of the songs that we sing together when we have the Passover dinner, and this is our most important holiday of the year. This is our Christmas. So we come, everyone together, sing a lot of songs, and one of them would translate into, in every generation someone tries to exterminate us. Right? This is part of what we're remembering. A week after Passover ends is the Holocaust Memorial Day. Exactly a week after that is the Soldiers' Memorial Day, and the following morning is Independence Day. And if you want, that's exactly the same story that you see in this picture again. Everyone has always tried to kill us. The Holocaust is the worst example of that. And then people had to fight and die for you to be here today, for you to have a state. So if you combine that with the idea that military has always been part of your life, and with the fact that while you're told that everyone has always tried to kill you, and I grew up in Jerusalem in the Second Intifada, people were trying to kill us. You know, we'd walk out to the streets and there were buses blowing up. So it became part of our reality, and it kind of strengthened that idea that we had, but more than that, it meant that we never had to ask ourselves why.
On today's program, we continue our coverage of the 2014 Friends of Sabeel North America Conference, entitled The Israeli Occupation, Breaking a Generation. The conference focused on the question of how to bring peace and justice to Israel and Palestine, detailing the experience of Palestinian children under Israeli occupation of their land. It also addresses the effects of the occupation on Israeli youth. Among the speakers were Amahl Bishara, Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Tufts University, Dr. Mads Gilbert, ER Director who witnessed the effects of Gaza's bombardment, Marty Federman, Jewish educator with American Jews for a Just Peace, Omar Barghouti, author of Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS, The Global Struggle for Palestinian Rights, and today's main feature, peace activist and conscientious objector Sahar Vardi. In addition to her ongoing work as a conscientious objector to Israeli military service, Sahar also actively protests the eviction of Palestinian families from their homes in order to make way for Jewish settlements. She is working with the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Her talk was part of a panel entitled Resisting Militarization in Israeli Society, moderated by Marty Federman.
The organizers wisely told us moderators to not spend a lot of time introducing the speakers. But I do want to say one thing before we start that I hope you'll keep in mind. I served in the U.S. Army during the Vietnam period and eventually applied for and received a discharge as a conscientious objector. And if that impacted my life in any way, it was primarily very positive, since the people that in my circle respected the fact that I did that. You need to keep in mind when you're listening to these two young women that that's not the situation in Israel. Israel has been and continues to be such a militarized society that so much revolves around your service. From employment and schooling and housing, and I suspect that they will talk about some of this, but the consequences for them are very real. And so it's not just a kind of neat thing that they do, and aren't they sweet? This is something that really impacts their lives forever. Our two speakers are Sahar Vardi, who is a 24-year-old from Jerusalem, and Danielle Yaor from the north of Israel. Danielle is 19. In both of their cases, these are not women who have refused to serve and then gone home to sit at home and let somebody else protect them. They have become real activists, and I would contend doing really serious work to defend their country. So I will stop there and turn this over to Sahar.
So first of all, thank you for the introduction. And what I'll try to do in the next 20 minutes or so is try to give kind of the framework in which Israelis are educated, and in many ways try to answer the question that was asked to the panel before, on what are Israeli soldiers thinking, or what do Israelis have to go through in order to be the ones implementing all the terrible things that we've saw before in Ivan's presentations, in Amahl's picture from Ida camp, and so on, because I think it's a really crucial thing to understand. If we're trying to counter the occupation, if we're trying to protest it, then we really need to understand some of the fundamentals that allow it to continue. So, as was said, my name is Sahar. I was born and raised in Jerusalem. I today work for the American Friends Service Committee on their Israel program. And what we try to do is counter the militarization of Israeli society. And that's a very big word that I would try to unpack in the time that I have here today. So just a show of hands, how many of you have been to Israel, specifically Israeli cities? Quite a few. Well, those of you who have probably noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the first things you'd notice coming in from the outside is the amount of weapons on the streets. You walk down a street and you'll have police officers armed, you'll have armed security guards, you'll have soldiers walking around with their M16 assault rifles, you'll have people on civilian clothes walking around with their M16 assault rifles. Some of them might be settlers that have permits to carry arms. Some of them might be soldiers on vacation. Soldiers, when they go home for the weekend, take their M16s home. So that means that you go out on a Friday night to a pub, you might very well be sitting next to someone who will happen to have his assault rifle with him when he's going out. What that means is that we are completely used to seeing weapons. The two pictures here behind me, in one of them you can see a soldier, again with his M16, going to just buy food somewhere. And on the other picture you can see the fighter jet that was decided by the mayor of Jerusalem, the mayor of Beersheba, who was the former head of the Air Force in Israel and then became mayor, decided that the right decorations for the roundabouts in the cities are fighter jets. So this is the kind of environment that we're very much used to, but if we go more specifically to look at the education that we get, this is probably a very telling picture. This is a worksheet that was given to children in kindergarten to learn how to count. So these are probably 3-4-year-old kids. And what you can see here, and probably have already noticed, that some of the symbols that are used are tanks and airplanes. The symbol at the bottom that has two of them is the symbol of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Force. But the rest of this piece of paper also includes doves and olive branches. It includes Knesset, the Israeli parliament, the symbol of Israel, the Star of David, the flag of Israel. And if any of you had to guess what was the person putting this all together thinking, what does this represent? If you had to give one word, what would that be?
Patriotism.
Patriotism? Zionism? I've heard a lot of things, but seeking peace. A lot of these things they're all kind of the same thing. This is Israel, right? This is what Israeli identity looks like. And Israeli identity is part of its institutions, the symbols of the state, peace, obviously, who doesn't want peace, but also the military. One of the interesting things that we often don't notice about the symbol of the Israeli military, which I'm sure that a lot of you have seen a lot, can anyone tell me what it is? It's too small for you to see there, so anyone remember? It's a sword with an olive branch wrapped around it. And we kind of skip through that many times, but in many ways that's kind of how we see the military. The military is not there to try to kill anyone or occupy. It's there to protect. It's there to, in many ways, bring about peace. That's the kind of idea that we grow up with. But by the time we get into the education system, the military is much more present. You can see here two pictures. The picture on your left is a picture of a program called Teacher Soldiers. What happens is that because there is conscription in Israel for both men and women, the military finds itself with quite too many soldiers. And what they've been doing since the get-go, since the creation of the military, is that they have an educational corps that is responsible, among other things, to teach in schools. So you have 19-year-old, mostly women, who during their military service, instead of being combat or anything else, go into schools, usually underprivileged schools that are understaffed, and are very happy to get free staffing, and they go to teach English or math or Hebrew. So beyond the fact that this also means that these schools get very bad schooling, because, I mean, these young ladies might be very clever, but they have absolutely no tools, and were not taught how to teach. But beyond that, it means that you will have a soldier in uniform teaching you. And again, this idea that the military is completely normalized into your life is very visible. By the time we get to high school, it's literally everywhere. You'll have soldiers coming in and out of the different classrooms, explaining about the different units. You'll go out to military bases in which different units will try to convince you to try to get into their unit. There's a soldier who's responsible for every year class, so you also always know who to ask. So there's someone in your school responsible for that, and you can go to them. In the 11th grade, there's this week of basic training. So you go out to a school with your, to a military base with your classmates as part of school activity for kind of a week of, basic training. You learn how to put on a uniform and how to take orders and learn how to shoot. And this is all part of school activity. So really, by the time you've reached the age of 18, you've never asked yourselves about military service. You know that you're going to military service. Literally everything until that point has prepared you to that. Just to make sure that this is not some conspiracy about the preparation for military service in the education system. In the written goals of the education system, since they were written in 1951 until today, probably the only thing that didn't change is preparation for military service as part of the written goals of the education system. A program that started a few years ago, part of the kind of privatization of the education system in Israel, and trying to have teachers have financial incentives to get better excellence from their students. One of the ways in which that excellence is measured is through military service. So if you increase the enlistment rates of your class, you literally get paid for it. So again, this is not something that anybody's trying to hide. It's part of a very clear policy. What I would like to say is that's probably not the only part of that education, and it's really important to understand the historical narrative that is created for us around that as well. And what you see here in the picture, I guess, is a combination of these both aspects. So what you see here is a general, the head of the South District of the Israeli military, who was retiring, and the lady is the head of the South District of the Ministry of Education in Israel. So they're having this farewell thing, thanking each other for years of cooperation. So again, this cooperation between the military and education. But what's interesting for me is the gift that this general decided to give to this lady. So you have 3 pictures framed, and I don't know if you can see them in much details, but the picture to the far left is a sculpture carved into one of the gates of the old city in Jerusalem, and what it shows are Jews taking relics out of the Second Temple when the Romans are destroying it. So this is a story of historical religious persecution of Jews. The second picture is the picture from the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of the little child surrendering. So obviously a picture that represents the Holocaust. And then the last picture is the picture of the paratroopers, the Israeli paratroopers in the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem when they're occupying it in 1967. Now the story that's kind of told here is the story of historical persecution of Jews. This has always been part of our identity. The Holocaust is obviously the worst example of that. And then the fact that today we have an army that can prevent that from happening. That is the role of the army in that story, to make sure that there is no second Holocaust. Another good example for that narrative is in the Hebrew calendar. There's the month between April and May, which starts with Passover. And I imagine most of you know the story of Passover, the story of the Exodus from Egypt. It's a story of liberation from persecution. In many ways, it's seen as the place where the people of Israel are created as a nation out of persecution. And one of the important things about that holiday, the main commandment is to remember. But one of the songs that we sing together when we have the Passover dinner, and this is our most important holiday of the year. This is our Christmas. So we come, everyone together, sing a lot of songs, and one of them would translate into, in every generation someone tries to exterminate us. Right? This is part of what we're remembering. A week after Passover ends is the Holocaust Memorial Day. Exactly a week after that is the Soldiers' Memorial Day, and the following morning is Independence Day. And if you want, that's exactly the same story that you see in this picture again. Everyone has always tried to kill us. The Holocaust is the worst example of that. And then people had to fight and die for you to be here today, for you to have a state. So if you combine that with the idea that military has always been part of your life, and with the fact that while you're told that everyone has always tried to kill you, and I grew up in Jerusalem in the Second Intifada, people were trying to kill us. You know, we'd walk out to the streets and there were buses blowing up. So it became part of our reality, and it kind of strengthened that idea that we had. But more than that, it meant that we never had to ask ourselves why. You know, you'd think that if someone, why would a 19-year-old Palestinian boy come into Jerusalem, blow himself up, and kill other people with him? You'd think that would be a relevant question. But we didn't have to ask because we knew the answer. The answer is that's what people do. There was a plaque in a school a few years ago, a year and a half ago, that in the middle it said, this is an elementary school, and in the middle it said, who tried to kill us? And then it had different lines, to Pharaoh, to Haman, a bad guy from Purim, to the Greek and the Romans, to Hitler, to Ahmadinejad, and to the Arabs as a whole. So you have this complete, you know, it's everything. It's historical, it's religious, it's present day, and there's no separation between it. So we know why people try to kill us. It's because it's a historical fact. It's just what people do. So that's a lot of kind of where soldiers come from. But I think it's important to look at militarism not only as preparation for conscription, but also what does it mean for the rest of society after military service. Because in Israel today, we have a situation in which the concept of citizenship is combined with military service. So this is just one example of this. This is taken out of the website of a political party in Israel, the second biggest political party in Israel, Israel Beitenu. Lieberman, the head of it, is our foreign minister. You might have heard of him. And only good things I see. And they're talking here about what should new citizens, how should new citizens be defined, and one of the criteria that they add for that is military service. In order to be a citizen, you would have to serve in military service. And this connection between rights and duties was obviously not born in Israel. I mean, it's kind of the rhetoric of the French Revolution in many ways. But specifically in Israel, it is completely around military service. What that means, among other things, is that groups that don't serve in the army, for instance, 20% of the citizens of Israel are Palestinians. They are automatically exempt from military service. What that means is that they are automatically not equal citizens, and that in the public discourse, it's legitimate for them to be second-class citizens because they didn't do their duties. So why would they get equal rights? So a lot of the discourse around the schools being under budgeted, their municipalities being under budgeted, is connected to the fact, well, you know, they didn't serve in the army, so they didn't give up their 3 years of their life. Why should they get the same rights? The way tax is calculated in Israel includes if you did or didn't serve in the military. You literally pay less taxes if you did serve in the army. So this is all part of what a citizen of Israel is. Another aspect of that citizenship value is when we look into Israeli politics. Because obviously in politics you'll want the finest citizens of the state, which would mean in Israel you would want soldiers. And a lot of our politicians run their campaigns on what they did in the army. Netanyahu ran a lot of his campaigns on his brother who died in the army. This is kind of how the rhetoric that you use. Probably the best example of this is that since 1967 until today, Israel has had only one Minister of Defense who wasn't a high-ranking general before becoming Minister of Defense. Now, you tell that to Israelis, they'll all say, well, obviously, it's the Ministry of Defense. You want a soldier to run it. You tell that to anyone else in the world, and they'll say, well, that's supposed to be a political position. I mean, they'll get information from the army, they'll get information from the foreign ministry, they'll calculate things and make a political decision. In Israel, it's very clear that it's not. It's a military decision. Literally, the people who do it are people who, from the age of 18 until they retired in their 50s or 60s, did nothing but military service. So you're going to give them a problem, any problem, say a Palestinian uprising, literally the only way they know how to solve it is through a military solution. They don't think outside of that paradigm. So that also influences a lot of our political system as a whole, and probably the best example of that is our ex-chief of staff, ex-prime minister, ex-minister of defense, Ehud Barak. Some of you probably heard of him. He's a good example for that, first of all, because he did that path of going straight from the military career into a political career and is still there today. But what he's now shifting into is the private sector. And this is an important part of the militarism in Israel as well, because a lot of these ex-generals go into the arms industries, the private arms industries in Israel. And we cannot talk about militarism in Israel without talking about the militarized economy that's created around that. So the first part of that is military spendings. Israel today spends about 20% of its budget on military spendings. That's about 6.2% of the GDP of the country. The US, which is a very big military spender as well, spends about 4.4% of its GDP. The world average, if you were wondering, is 2.5%. So we're all in a pretty bad place. That said, Israel is really one of the highest military spenders in the world. But more important for me than the spending is the income that comes from the military economy. And part of it is thanks to you guys. So you all know that the US gives about $3.1 billion a year to Israel in military aid. Except for Iraq under the American occupation in the last decade, that Israel has consistently been the biggest military aid. Oh wow. The biggest military aid recipient throughout the years. But one of the interesting anecdotes about those funds is that 75% of them have to be bought back here in the US, which means that the biggest lobby for that is not AIPAC, it's not the Jewish Zionist lobby, it's Lockheed Martin, it's Boeing. It's the American companies that in the end benefit from the bottom line of that. But more than the US aid, the biggest income of the Israeli economy from the military is the export. And today, Israel is one of the leading weapons exporters in the world. We're ranked in the 10 leading weapons exporters. It's the #1 weapon exporter per capita in the world. Today, the #1 drone exporter in the world in absolute numbers, which for a small state is a pretty impressive fact. But we have to ask ourselves why. Why can Israel be so successful in its military export? And the reason is that we can prove that it works. So I have this quote from a former marketer of one of the large military companies in Israel who said, "A scenario in which there won't be a large military operation for 20 years will severely hurt the arms industries." And he's just saying it, you know, if we can't test and then show off our weapons in battle, we can't sell them. So just as an example to that we saw this summer, while over 2,000 people were killed in Gaza and hundreds of thousands of people became refugees and still don't have houses to go back to, this is a short list of the weapons that made their first operational debut during the operation this summer. And this is what just a week ago Israel signed a $144 million agreement with India, selling weapons, selling missiles. A lot of them were missiles that were tested this summer, and you can see here in the poster for a drone, the Hermes 450, that it has the yellow stamp on the top of it. What that stamp says is battle proven. This is literally how you market weapons, which means that when the US wants to build their fence between the US and Mexico, then they're going to use Israeli companies like Elbit Systems that have developed the technology for the fence back home, and then they're going to use it here as well. This is also true in, you see Israeli armed vehicles in the favelas of Rio de Janeiro. It's an international phenomenon. But what I would like to end with is looking a little bit on the bright side of that, if you like. One of the things that this global arms industry that looks very scary to us and something that we almost can't touch, one of the things that it also does is that it mainly exports oppression. And that oppression is slowly used against more and more groups in society. And we saw a good example of that this summer in Ferguson. The St. Louis police force, by the way, trains with Israeli police and military. So a lot of the techniques that we saw this summer were actually Israeli techniques. What we see here in the picture is a tear gas canister. Now, the tear gas that was used in Ferguson is the same tear gas that's used to oppress Palestinians back home. It's actually US manufactured. It's a company called CSI. But one of the interesting things that happened this summer was you had Palestinian activists who are very used to this tear gas tweeting to their counterparts in Ferguson on how to deal with a tear gas. And for me, that's a beautiful thing that we should concentrate on, because that's a place in which we can see how different people who are oppressed by these systems can come together and try to build solidarity to see how they can oppose them. Because these systems are very much based on the fact that we are willing to cooperate in them. And right after me, you'll hear from Danielle, who is an Israeli refuser, and will speak a little bit about how hard it is and how important it is to refuse to cooperate with the military itself as an Israeli citizen who's supposed to serve, but it's important for us to always have in mind how can we refuse to cooperate with that same military system. Most of you will not be asked to sit in prison if you don't cooperate with that system, or you won't be asked to be ostracized by your families. So what we can ask you is to make sure that your money doesn't go into that you don't buy products that are produced in the Israeli settlements, or that in general profit from the Israeli occupation, and that you ask your representatives not to be a part of that as well. So thank you very much. And
that was activist and conscientious objector Sahar Vardi talking at the Friends of Sabeel North America conference. Stay tuned next week for more coverage of the recent Friends of Sabeel North America conference entitled The Israeli Occupation, Breaking a Generation, that took place this past November in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Stay tuned, there's more to come after this short program ID.
You are watching The Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org. are watching the Arabic Hour, a program of news, views, culture, cuisine, and the Arab American experience. To view today's program or any previous programs, log on to our website at www.arabichour.org.
Thank you so much for joining us at the Arabic Hour today. Some stations will be leaving us, and we look forward to seeing you next week. For those of you staying with us for the remainder of the hour, we hope you enjoy the last musical segment following the closing credits. On behalf of all of the volunteers here at the Arabic Hour, this is Ghinwa Hakim, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
The Arabic Hour has been brought to you in part by the William G. Abdullah Memorial Library, a resource center for information and education on the Arab American experience. The American Arabic Benevolent Association, ABA, an umbrella association for community endeavors. The Nicholas G. Barham Veterans Association and Ladies Auxiliary, providing veteran services, scholarships with community pride. And by our members as well as contributions from viewers like you.